Officer here with the Hampton Roads Community Action Program, and I'd like to welcome each and every one of you for joining us both in person and virtually. So on behalf of our CEO, Edith G. White, she brings her warm welcome to you as well to the HR CAP event in recognition of Fair Housing Month. We gather here today in partnership with Housing Opportunity Made Equal of Virginia to commemorate a pivotal moment in our nation's history. Fair Housing Month holds profound significance rooted in the struggle for justice and equality. It's a testament to the hard-fought battles and triumphs of civil rights movements, from the landmark Fair Housing Act of 1968 to the ongoing efforts to combat housing discrimination. This month serves as a reminder of our collective journey towards a more just society. At HR CAP, we stand on the shoulders of those who fought tirelessly for fair housing rights. Our commitment to equality and inclusion is unwavering as we continue to advocate for policies and practices to ensure that everyone has access to safe and affordable housing free from discrimination. For those unfamiliar, HR CAP, or the Hampton Roads Community Action Program, stands as a beacon of hope and progress in our community. Through our array of programs and services, we strive to uplift individuals and families, particularly those that are facing economic hardships. From housing assistance to workforce development, educational initiatives to health services, HR CAP serves as a steadfast ally for those in need. Our dedication to fostering inclusion and equitable communities aligns perfectly with the spirit of Fair Housing Month. It's an opportune time to reflect on our collective responsibility to ensure that everyone has access to safe, affordable housing without facing discrimination. I also would like to take advantage of this opportunity to extend a special invitation to you to join us for our upcoming Pathways to Progress breakfast. This will take place on April the 23rd from 10 to 12 at the Holiday Inn in Newport News. This event promises insightful discussions and networking opportunities, furthering our mutual goal of creating pathways to success for all members of our community. Now, without further ado, let us transition to our moderator for today, Ms. Regina Chaney from Home of Virginia, who will guide us through today's discussion and activities and also bring welcome from home. And for our virtual attendees, keep an eye out for the Pathways to Progress breakfast invitation, which will be popping up during the registration process. So again, thank you so much, and thank each of you for coming today.
Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Regina Chaney. I'm the Community Engagement and Outreach Specialist at Home of Virginia and the moderator for today's session. Home, Housing Opportunities Made Equal, is a statewide private nonprofit housing, fair housing and civil rights organization. We've been providing housing services to residents in Virginia for over 53 years, and we are recognized nationally for the work that we do relating to fair housing and civil rights. We're excited to partner with HR CAP to have this conversation here in Hampton Roads today about the intersection of evictions and fair housing. So again, in my presentation, but he's already said it, we're excited to celebrate. Today is actually the 56th anniversary of the Fair Housing Rights. It was April 11th, so we are excited to be here. So I want to thank all of you who are here in person and those of you who are virtual for your contribution in continuing the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, working to address housing-related systemic injustices that perpetuate segregation, concentrations of poverty, and wealth inequality. I'd like to introduce our panelists, and they have like a long bio. They have so much expertise, and they've been in this field for a minute, except for Callie, who's new, which I hope she stays with us when she graduates in May. We have Laura Dobbs. Laura is Home's Director of Policy. In this role, Laura advocates for state and local policies to dismantle housing discrimination and expand housing service. We have Erik Johnston next to her, serves as the President and CEO of Virginia Community Action Partnership. which is located in Richmond. He leads this statewide membership association in advancing the priorities of the 31 nonprofit, private, public community action agencies that are focused on creating economic opportunities and moving the people of Virginia from poverty. And then we have Callie. Callie Hoagland, I practiced all night, I still got it wrong, is a current graduate student and an up and coming expert in the field of eviction research. As a Wilder Fellow at RVA Eviction Lab, Callie has worked closely with the Virginia Eviction Reduction Pilot, aiding in qualitative and quantitative research and reporting on the successes of the program. So please extend a warm welcome to our expert housing team here. Before we get started, Callie and Erik will start us off with some background and data before we get into our questions.
Can you hear me? Maybe? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. I'm going to be talking about a little bit of level setting of eviction data and what we have for this area of Virginia. So to get us started, the RVA Eviction Lab is a part of the VCU Wilder School, and we do data for all of Virginia, looking at eviction filings and judgments, looking at default judgments. We come out with quarterly reports every quarter, so if you have an organization that needs data, we probably have something for you. We also do reports with different organizations, like we recently did a Right to Counsel report with Virginia Poverty Law Center. So we like to have special projects like that as well. So if your organization ever has special data need, feel free to reach out. But to get us started, I want to kind of level set of how does eviction work, just so we're all on the same page. I think most of us in this room probably already know all of this information, but just to level set us all. So when we're thinking about eviction, there's several different terms and ways that we describe eviction. So the first way is an eviction filing. Eviction filings refers to when the property owner actually files the eviction against the tenant. This is not the point where the tenant has to leave the property. This is the point where they are getting told they need to go to court. And then the eviction judgment is in the court when the tenant is judged against basically whether they can stay in the property or not. There's a couple other terms that go along with those. One is informal eviction. So we have many evictions in our state that are not necessarily through the courts. And those are termed informal evictions. That could be when a landlord doesn't renew the lease for a tenant, or a landlord increases the rent to a point where the tenant can no longer afford to live there. There's other examples of informal evictions where maybe the landlord tells the tenant to leave and it's not formally through the courts, but those are evictions that we don't have a lot of data on. And then we also see something called default judgments. We see a lot of these in Virginia as well. This basically means that when the tenant fails to appear in court, they receive a default judgment, which means that the landlord is going to receive their property back because the tenant didn't show up. Now, the tenant can technically go back and try to get a retrial if they had other extenuating circumstances like a job or childcare. They were unable to go to court, but that is called a default judgment. So there's several different grounds for eviction in Virginia, but as we probably all know, the most common is non-payment of rent. And during the pandemic era, that was the type that was not allowed. So we did see a lot lower eviction filings and judgments, which we'll get to in a minute. But there's also several other reasons that landlords can file for eviction, and those include violations of the lease or violations of the law within the property of the landlord. And then this is just a Candyland-looking slide that basically talks through the process of eviction in Virginia. So I won't go through it in super depth, but basically we know that first you'll get something called a pay or quit, or also called a notice of termination or default, which basically just tells the tenant that they will get filed against. At that point, the tenant can pay their rent if they have it or not. And then at that point, they would get the unlawful detainer, which is the eviction filing. They can go to court, then they get a judgment. There's an appeal period. And then after that is when the sheriff can come and give the writ of eviction, which is telling the tenant that they need to leave the property. There's a couple other parts in there that can happen depending on the circumstances of the eviction, but that's generally the timeline for what it looks like in Virginia. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm going to talk through some of the data that we have at RV Eviction Lab and what evictions are looking like in Virginia, and specifically also in this area of Virginia. So to get us started, the national average eviction rate is 2.6%. So keep that in mind as we go forward and are looking at what our rate looks like in this area of Virginia. So a lot of this work, I think for all of us we were talking about, started in 2018 when Matthew Desmond came out with and was really bringing to the forefront information about eviction in Virginia. We saw that Richmond was number 2 in the entire United States for eviction rates. Portsmouth, Chesapeake, and Hampton, thank you, were also in the top 10 for small and mid-sized cities. And so this really brought to the forefront that Virginia had a lot of work to do when it came to evictions. This is more recent data from the Princeton Eviction Lab, so you can see Virginia still has a very high filing rate compared to other states, but we're actually lower than we are since the pandemic. So it's gone down, which is great, and I'll talk some more about that. But that's kind of what brought to the forefront a lot of this work that all of us have been doing. So for every formal eviction that we're seeing, and I'll show on the next slide what those formal eviction numbers look like, there's usually 2 to 5 forced renter moves, which are, like I mentioned before, rents going up to the point where the tenant can't afford to stay or the landlord not renewing the lease. So despite the numbers that we're looking at today and the things we're talking about, we know that this problem is actually a lot larger than what we are able to see. And again, you can see here kind of the two processes. One is the legal process of non-payment of rent. You're going through the courts, then you get evicted by the sheriff, versus maybe being involuntary or forced to move is also can cause the same issues as an eviction, but it's just not formally through the courts. Okay, so this is some of the data that we do at the Eviction Lab. So you can see here, this is Virginia evictions filings and judgments from 2019 to 2023. The RV Eviction Lab started in 2019, so that's when our data started coming out. And you can see that orangey yellow color is eviction filings, and then the kind of brown color is eviction judgments. So you can see our filings are usually twice as many as the judgments. So we're fortunate that not every filing turns into a judgment. However, that doesn't mean that those renters didn't still move or were able to stay in the property every time. It may have been that they just moved out before they actually received a judgment. And as you can see, 2019 numbers are very high. We saw a big dip when the pandemic began, and again, that is due to a lot of those COVID protections that we saw, which ended in the middle of 2022, and that's when you can see those numbers jump back up. But we're really fortunate that those numbers have stayed slightly lower than they were before the pandemic in most every area of Virginia. And this is some other data that we look at the Eviction Lab. When people are going to court, it's important to understand what amount of rent they're actually getting evicted for. And so you can see here, this is the first column is median gross rent. So we have Central Virginia, Hampton Roads, and then Northern Virginia on this chart. So you can see median gross rent, $1,200, and then $1,900 there for Northern Virginia. And then for the amount owed, you can see that the amount owed is never more than 2.2 months of rent. And this is something that's been changing. If you look back on data that we have at the Eviction Lab, prior to the pandemic, people were usually getting evicted for a lot more months of rent. But since the pandemic, it seems that landlords and property management have really gotten in the habit, and the way that they're evicting is a lot more, not sure the word for it, but yeah, automatic, exactly. So after 1.5 months, they're evicting, and that's that. And so we're seeing these numbers of how much people are owing actually being less than before the pandemic. And again, I mentioned rent increases is one of the ways that people are informally removed from where they live. About 40% of renters saw rent increases higher than peak inflation, and we're seeing Black renters report higher rent increases in general. And so you can see this red box here is showing all of the rent increases above $100 to $500 of rental increases, which if you're a family living month to month, paycheck to paycheck, that is something that would definitely affect your bottom line and your ability to stay in where you're living. And again, this is seen as a lot higher for Black African American renters than it is for white renters. So how did we get to this point of where we're at today? So in your minds, I would love for you to think of the following on the slide. What do you think are the most influential characteristics on neighborhood eviction rates? So we have percent renter occupied, median property value, median rent, household income, percent non-white, percent Black, poverty rate, and percent rent burdened. So in your mind, just think about what you think is the most influential for a neighborhood's eviction rate. And what we found through the eviction lab work is that the most influential data point for evictions is actually percent non-white or percent Black. You would think, at least when I started working at the eviction lab, that it would be the most renters, right? More renters means more evictions. But that's actually one of the least influential characteristics that we see for eviction rates, and median rent is also not super influential. So even if rents are super high, that doesn't necessarily mean that eviction rates are going to be high. Some other characteristics that are more in the middle is poverty rate, property value, household income, and then percent rent burdened. But again, the most influential characteristic for eviction rates is percent non-white or percent Black. The only characteristic that we didn't include in this one, because it's not about the tenant or the household necessarily, is the landlord type and the ownership structure. So the way that the home that's being rented is owned really affects the ways that evictions are filed. And so as Laura helped me, a lot of those corporate landlords, as you can see, institutional investors, they have very automatic eviction processes because they have often higher portfolios, more renters, so they have these very automatic processes that makes it very hard for tenants to work around, try to figure out payment plans or different options if they are falling behind, versus larger landlords and then small landlords actually evict at much lower rates. And this is kind of self-explanatory if you think about it, but also very, very, very unfortunate. The most common age to be threatened with eviction in the United States is when you're a child, between birth and 19 years old. Black Americans make up 19% of renters as well, but 51% of those threatened with eviction. And back to the age part, you can imagine, if you have a single mom or a family, it's often 2 kids, so those children are the ones that are often bearing the brunt of this eviction crisis that we have. For Black children aged 0 to 4, 12% were threatened with eviction in the past year, or about 321,000. And we're also seeing a kind of not necessarily newer crisis, but maybe coming to the forefront more of people above the age of 65 facing eviction. And we're seeing more and more renters in that age bracket starting to face that issue. Okay, I think that's all for me right now.
Erik Johnston, I serve as CEO of the Virginia Community Action Partnership. Thank you, Callie, for that sobering overview of, and really you ended with some slides about why this topic is so critical during Fair Housing Month and during what Kevin O.T. at HRCAP talked about at the beginning about the roots of community action and the roots of the civil rights movement and fair housing being combined. A couple things at the start. I also want to emphasize a couple points that Callie said, but I want to thank Housing Opportunities Made Equal, Regina, for moderating this. Such a great partner and such a leader. We're so fortunate in Virginia to have such a strong fair housing leadership. So grateful for that, and Laura. And I also want to thank Kevin and Edith at HRCAP. Kevin is our board chair at the Virginia Community Action Partnership, and Yvette for help working together to put this together. We are an association of 31 local governments, nonprofit entities who are united in our mission of looking at the community needs of where we are and looking at ways to make America, live up to America's promise by ending poverty and creating economic mobility. It's been the honor of my life to represent this organization because of their mission and because of what they believe in. And while it was sobering to start with those slides about the facts on evictions, the thing I want to say is that I'm extremely hopeful about the future in Virginia. I'd like to take a minute, if you're on the Zoom or if you're in the room, please raise your hand if you have worked on housing-related issues over the last 5 years, including today. Keep them high. Raise your hand if you've worked on economic mobility for an organization. Keep it up, keep them up, keep them up. And on the phone, you can, on the Zoom, you can raise your hand with your dog or cat in your Zoom room and your plant. Nearly every hand in this room is up, and I know in the audience. And so I want to thank all of you for being leaders over the last 5 years in uncovering what is one of the most traumatic experiences and manifestations of poverty in America and Virginia. Evictions are so many causes that Callie went through, but really at its core, both there's a fair housing component and a racial equity component that is the top issue on the data related to evictions. And the second on the list was poverty. And so just overall poverty rates in Virginia are huge. The level setting, Callie went over the history, but a couple things I'd say is just think about it. In 2018, not many people were talking about evictions. You probably were. This is a group of folks who were working on this pre-pandemic, pre-2019, pre-Matthew Desmond. But housing providers and people living in housing have been dealing with the implications of a lack of affordable housing, a crisis in that in our Commonwealth and nation, and a system set up to be about the churn. And on a piece of paper, the churn and evictions is just a data point, but it's mostly impacting young families, young Black families disproportionately. Callie's data, 12% of Black children 0 to 4 experiencing an eviction. 19%, in birth to 19 being the highest number of individuals impacted by evictions. This is about our children, and about the traumatic impacts that evictions have on the future of our children. And I would just say that why I have hope is because there is in Virginia, I think we were fortunate by the power of the pen that Matthew Desmond talked about evictions in the book Evicted. The New York Times exposed what, once it was exposed, there was a bipartisan consensus. This is unacceptable. This is unacceptable to have that kind of churn that's impacting health outcomes, long-term outcomes for so many of our families, our neighbors. Unacceptable. Bottom line, that was a gift that exposure gave. And there was bipartisan consensus with President Trump's CDC, the Virginia General Assembly, Governor Northam creating the first positions at DHCD, the Virginia State Department of Housing and Community Development, saying, what could the state do to lead on evictions? Which led to things like the creation of the Virginia Eviction Reduction Pilot. We have a homelessness response system. People experiencing homelessness, there's continuums of care I see in this room and on the Zoom. We have a system saying that homelessness is not acceptable in our nation. We can create the same system on eviction prevention and diversion. And so we went through a period of time where pre-pandemic, those systems were starting to get created, and then $1 billion of rent relief poured through Virginia. I saw and got inspired by community action when I saw those members and many of you and our partners across the state stand up and in the middle of the pandemic deliver rent relief. And I saw housing providers and those housing advocates representing tenants come together and put down their long-standing fights over the landlord-tenant laws of Virginia to say we can agree on evictions are not acceptable in a pandemic. But really, if you think about it, the health impacts, the education impacts, they're not acceptable pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. And so we were given a gift during the pandemic of light shining on a really, really traumatic impact of poverty and racism. So we have an opportunity to create systems that make evictions rare and humane. Housing providers, we need more housing providers, and we need housing providers to get paid to create more affordable housing. We need families to live in stable housing and not fear being evicted. 3.6 million Americans are evicted right now, this country. The churn of families and children going through that, it's completely unacceptable. But the cool thing about, and I'll talk more about it later, is that we now know, because of all of what you have done, those in the Zoom, state leadership, federal, local, that there are systems that can be put in place, like the Virginia Eviction Reduction Pilot, with small amounts of investment, that even if you don't care about people, if you don't care about whether people get evicted or not, the state and federal government pay more for an eviction after the eviction than the sometimes couple hundred or $1,000 on eviction prevention right there to keep families stably housed in an emergency. It's incredible just for the data points. If you're just a number cruncher, it makes sense to not allow evictions for our workforce, our children. It's also the humane thing to not allow our neighbors to be out in the streets and cycle through a deepening cycle of poverty that happens after an eviction long term. So I just would say, we'll talk a little bit more about later, but in community action, under Kevin's leadership, we started a housing committee we do community needs assessments every 3 years. The top 1 or 2 issue is always affordable housing. It's a statewide issue right now. There's some big cities that got in the New York Times about the high evictions rate, which is a higher evictions rate is a challenge and a problem that should be fixed. Evictions are a problem across this Commonwealth. And the dollar amounts in some of our rural areas where we can help solve this are even smaller, where we can really turn the needle. I've never seen a policy issue with more low-hanging fruit of things that people could agree on, where we could really make a huge difference. So I'm just really excited because we've just been through 5 years where there's been light shined on, $1 billion went through. Virginia went from being the most evicting state in the country to having some of the lowest evictions rates in the country, and got more rent relief money out with the partners combined, the state agencies, than the whole country combined for a period of 3 months during the pandemic. So we have a lot to say. Like we together said, we're going to stop this, but the biggest danger is we go back to, this is one thing where we can't go back pre-pandemic and let this not be shined on, because we have an opportunity with local systems. I'll talk about Alexandria as a model later, where we can really, with smaller investments, make evictions rare, brief, and humane, and help housing providers, our local economy, and our way of life to live up to America's promise. So I hope you come out of this room and ask yourself, what could you do to keep shining that light and make sure that we can help be a beacon for what the rest of the nation could do. So I'm going to stop because you can see I have a little bit of passion.
Thank you, Erik. Thank you, Erik and Callie, for kind of giving us a background. We have a few questions that the panel will answer, and we have maybe some from the audience before we go into question and answers. So the first question is, and Callie, you sort of went over this in your presentation, but if you would sum it up, what is the difference between eviction rates now and before the pandemic?
Yeah, so we talked about it briefly, but before the pandemic, we saw pretty high filings and pretty high judgments. Again, pandemic went really low, and then post-pandemic, in most areas of Virginia, we've been seeing filings at about 80 to 90% of what they were before the pandemic. So not quite all the way there, but getting pretty close. And then judgments are actually even a little bit lower than they were before the pandemic compared to the number of filings that we have. So if we were seeing, for example, before the pandemic, maybe 50% of judgments to 100% filings. That's maybe I'm being confusing, but we're seeing a lower percentage of judgments for the number of filings that we're having, which is really great. And that's in almost every area of Virginia that we've been looking at, except for maybe Northern Virginia, where we've been seeing numbers almost back to where they were pre-pandemic. Yeah.
Next question is, what has changed in eviction intervention efforts? And I'm going to ask Erik to answer that.
Sure. So this is where the Virginia Eviction Reduction Pilot, and kudos to the Virginia Department of Housing Community Development team and partners who are implementing that in this region and across the state. It's only a $3.4 million program, right? But there's been some really amazing findings from that. It stood up pre-pandemic, and then the pandemic came, and there was $1 billion that came right through. But trying to separate out the data from that surge of rent relief, it's a flexible program that basically ensures creating local task force of housing providers, the courts, local government, nonprofits, community action, continuums of care. The list goes on, sheriff's departments, just a whole bunch of folks involved with the system around both economic stability and housing stability and eviction prevention and diversion. So prevention pre-courts, diversion once you have that, you're in the court process. So what's changed, obviously, is we don't have $1 billion in rent relief. And so we're back scarily to, like Callie said, we're at 80% of where we were pre-pandemic when things were awful, right? The summary, that's all, so we're not quite back to as bad as we used to be. And part of what we have the opportunity is with VERP, if we were to take that statewide, whether or not you have state funds, we need the state funds to incentivize this. But right now in every locality in Virginia, you could follow the VERP model, and it can look differently everywhere, but it's been proven successful in terms of being flexible funds to create those task force of combining all the local and regional resources you have, all the stakeholders, to build good relationships and look for those low-hanging fruit. There's so many little things you can do at the local level to make it much more difficult to come into an eviction process, so on the prevention side, and also once you're in it, to get out of it for both a benefit for the housing provider and the person living in housing. The Virginia Eviction Reduction Pilot in Alexandria, so it's the city of Alexandria is I just went there, and if you go and visit the city of Alexandria, what they're doing right now on eviction prevention, they're having the same sense of urgency that they had at the height of the pandemic. I'm telling you, you can't walk in there and meet these people and not come out like, these are people that are really ready to end evictions. And what they're doing is not very complicated. It's sophisticated, but there's a task force, and it has the components I mentioned earlier. And I want to give kudos to Allison Coleman and the team. She's our board member from VACAP, but she and her team and partners on that task force, they are doing so much, and they have a list of interventions, affordable housing creation, collaboration among providers, courthouse outreach and tenant education, housing stabilization policies, designated eviction prevention positions, data-informed programming and decision-making. They got a dashboard where you can see what are the top evicting properties in your locality, and they're surging human services to those properties so that you can prevent evictions right then and build relationships. And not, you saw that 20% of a big property is just, they're just gonna file that eviction, pay to quit. They're gonna do that to every tenant. They're working with those landlords to try to say, no, we're gonna not accept that in our city. We're gonna work with you to make sure that you get paid and we keep families stably housed. So that task force is incredible, but it's very replicatable, and you could do it region by region, locality by locality. There's other stories in this room of folks who are doing that through other VERP grants. They're working in the schools. They're identifying the kids most likely to be evicted, and they've got numbers of the 170 kids that avoided evictions through the partnership with their task force in the schools. But I'd say the biggest thing is, which is a real big believer, there's so much to argue about in this world, but that task force has people who have very different opinions on the landlord-tenant laws in our Commonwealth, who agree. Let's find the things we can agree on. Let's put money towards it, and let's make the evictions preventable that we can. And so there's a model that exists that's kind of what it's looking like now. To your question, Regina, is some localities are saying, okay, we don't have the billion in rent relief, but the eviction rates are filing back up. Housing affordability, it's the biggest part of inflation right now. So it is just, it's such a nationwide problem. There's so much that can be done to invest in creating a system locally so that evictions are rare and humane. So I just would say, I've got 54 slides on the city of Alexandria and I'm not going to share them all, but learn about what the city of Alexandria is doing, learn about what those other VERP grantees are doing. Court navigation is one, I should say. I asked the VERP team and their leadership. I mean, court navigation is a promising, very promising thing that you can do within the court system in partnership with the courts. I will say my biggest belief, though, is in prevention, pre the courts. Find where your highest evicting landlords are, surge human services, and the whole family approach to human services. You might not know you're sitting right now in the whole family innovation lab at HRCAP. We believe in community action in coordinated entry of services and surging to help families, whole families, move out of poverty. That's what's needed to really change things.
Okay, I'm going to steal some of that energy and hope from Erik, because I've been in this business for about 43 years, and we've been talking about affordable housing for 35. So I am going to steal some of that hope and energy from you. The next question, Callie, if you would talk a little more about or just kind of review what we know about who's getting evicted.
Yeah, definitely. And I wanted to follow up on something Erik said too. He mentioned that Alexandria has a website where they can look at who's getting the highest properties that are evicting. That's something that the RVA Eviction Lab worked on as well. They might have their own separate dashboard, but if you look up the evictors catalog, that's something that we worked on in conjunction with UVA. And if you go on there, you can search by your locality, you can search by zip code, and figure out who the highest evicting property managers or landlords are in your area. And we'll talk more about data later. The unfortunate part is some of these people own many, many properties. So you can't know which specific one is the one that's actually doing the evicting. But it's a really good start if you're in that space and want to know who those landlords are. As far as who's getting evicted, I know we've already talked about this, but the people that we're seeing getting evicted most highly are people of color. Black women really are the highest getting evicted with children. We are seeing some changes, and this is kind of like newer data that we don't necessarily have things to like totally back it up, but we're also seeing a lot of folks over the age of 65. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, is maybe a new demographic that is starting to deal with the issues of eviction, as maybe their retirement doesn't keep up with what they're able to pay for housing. Maybe their rent went up or their insurance or whatever it may be, and they're no longer able to afford to stay where they're living. But those are the biggest populations.
Thank you. The next question from the intervention side, where are we seeing the need? And I'd like to ask someone from HR CAP to comment on that. Is that Thomas? You got one? So the question is, from the intervention side, where are we seeing the need?
So, okay. Front and center. Yeah. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Thomas Sense. I'm the housing program manager here at HRCAP. So, where we're seeing the need mainly in Hampton Roads, we have a focus primarily on Newport News and Hampton, but it is all throughout the 7 cities. So, many of the places that we're looking at, they are typically Black and people of color dominated areas. Some of the data we have, you can narrow it down by zip code. And I can also attest to the fact that a lot of the demographics that have been referenced earlier, anecdotally, I've seen most of the people that have come through our programs fit the mold almost perfectly. So this is absolutely a problem. What we are attempting to do is take a multi-pronged approach to the problem. Not only do we want them to remain in their housing and have programs to help prevent eviction, but we want to be able to build them up and lift them out. So it's usually not just one and done. In order for them to truly be successful, there needs to be a focus on workforce development, childcare, transportation, all of these issues that make it more difficult for housing to be affordable. And I hope that narrows it down for you a little bit. Absolutely.
Anybody on the panel want to add to that, or Laura?
I mean, if we're looking at it from more of a state policy level, one of the things that graph shows is that when we have policy, like evictions can be policy driven, and when you have policies in place to prevent it, you can stop evictions. One of the different things we saw in intervention and why there's an increase in evictions is during the pandemic, Virginia had a policy in place through their rent relief program that before a landlord could evict a tenant, they had to apply for rent relief on behalf of the tenant. That made sure that, like, you know, they had the document showing what the tenant owed, they had that direct communication, but also left lines open that the tenant could also apply directly if for some reason their land. Now this one's, oh, there we go, okay. At home, through our, you know, we had the eviction diversion program for the city of Richmond, and we also coordinate a lot of the rent relief efforts. And at the time, I know our housing counselors were able to build good relationships with certain property managers who were like really willing to work with us, even after I don't know what to tell you. It's going in and out. And even after those protections ended and they weren't required to apply on behalf of the tenant, they were still willing to work with us. But towards the end, we started to see a huge change in management practices where they started to go back to a system where as soon as that tenant is late, they're getting hit with a late fee. Pay or quit goes out 5 days later. You know, our counselors would try working with them, asking for a little bit more time and flexibility to finish getting, you know, taking a look at the ledger, making sure that it's accurate, and getting a check cut to send to the landlord so they're made whole. And the property manager's like, I'm sorry, day 5, that notice is already sent to the attorney and they're already filing the case. There's nothing I can do to slow down this process. I have no control. And so we went from a system where like a tenant might be able to work out a payment plan with their landlord or like get connected with rent relief and have that flexibility. But in these investor-owned properties, and we have seen an increase in buying up of properties across Virginia, that they're out of state, they don't have an interest in working with tenants. It is a churn and burn model of automatically filing evictions as soon as that 5-day pay or quit ends. Now, I can be a bit pessimistic sometimes, but I'm going to borrow some of Erik's hopefulness that, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, but you know, we have a General Assembly that like cares about this issue, and new members who come from a diversity of experiences, people who have actually experienced homelessness, and I think understand it at a much deeper level. And there have been proposed policies to do things like require that if a tenant is only behind rent for 1 month, that the landlord offer a payment plan for that 1 month before they can file an eviction. You know, I think one of the pieces in that of data that Callie showed about how much rent is owed in that judgment amount. If you think about the timeline of evictions, so someone's behind 1 month, landlord sues, by the time they get into court, typically the landlord's going to ask for any root that has accrued since that filing, and depending on the jurisdiction, you might get evicted as little as 45 days. And so even though the amount they're showing is like roughly 1.5 months rent, they're probably only sued for 1 month's rent, and they've only accrued another half month's rent by the time that the court enters judgment. So if we can stop someone getting evicted just for owing 1 month's rent, we could drastically reduce the number of evictions in Virginia.
The next question I want to ask is, and I'm asking all panelists to chime in on this one, what are the fair housing implications in evictions? Who wants to start with that?
Sure. I mean, I think the data really speaks for itself on who are seeing like disparate impact of evictions. But I think we can also like really tie a thread from current eviction rates to historic discrimination. You know, I think a lot of us are familiar with the term redlining, and you can look out in your community and know where the segregated communities are. We have really not come very far on desegregation and deconcentrating poverty. And so if you're looking at eviction rates at a neighborhood level, it's very predictable. The places that have the highest eviction rates are in formerly red line neighborhoods. It is not a surprise. Should not be shocking to anyone that that's the case. And so evictions I see is really like a legacy as of our country's, you know, discriminatory housing policies of the past. And the only way we're going to overcome that is with more intentional policies of deconcentrating poverty, creating more affordable housing, not just continuing to build it in the same poverty neighborhoods, but in neighborhoods of opportunity, bringing opportunity to formerly segregated communities. And one of the practices I mentioned of these larger investor companies is looking at where they're buying their properties and using these models of churning evictions. It's not just churning evictions, but seeing a lot more junk fees added in leases that tenants can't get out of, like trash concierge fees is $45. You know, a fee just to have your package stored at the property management office, fees for having to pay your rent online and no way to like actually drop off a physical check anymore. They add up. I mean, during legislative session, I was talking to one of the legislative aide. She's like, so I signed this lease that said my rent was only $900 a month. But by the time I add up all the fees, it's an extra $200. How is someone supposed to make an informed choice about what is affordable when there are these extra hidden fees that has really become rampant? There was a case in Maryland that got a lot of news because it's owned by the properties connected with Jared Kushner. But one of the elements of that case was a fair housing claim that they were targeting properties in certain neighborhoods in Baltimore, Maryland, picking high poverty, African American majority neighborhoods, buying them up, increasing the rent, adding new fees, refusing to fix the properties, and relying on evictions as a business model. And so I think if you're mapping out where we're seeing the worst offender properties and where they're choosing to invest and buy up, I think there's a fair housing case made there. Whether or not it's intentional or just has this disparate impact, I think it's something worth examining further.
I'll try this. Yep, mic's working good this time. I mean, Laura, you said it really well, and the slide that Callie showed about the data showing this is a huge fair housing issue. The only thing I'd add to the conversation is that so evictions are a policy choice, and I think it's fitting that Matthew Desmond wrote the book about Evicted and talked about the policy choice there. And I think Laura's point on redlining is critical, and redlining existed all across our state and nation. So I would just say that one thing that keeps getting lost is this is a statewide issue too, right? So that's one thing where, going back to the second early question too, Regina, the interventions are needed statewide, which is important for building the coalitions together to make this a bipartisan issue, to make evictions rare and humane. The other thing I'd say is that Matthew Desmond followed up his Evicted book with Poverty by America, and where he basically demonstrates that poverty is a choice. So childhood poverty was decreased by more than 50% during the pandemic. This eviction and rent relief occurred not in a vacuum, but with additional child care subsidies, additional housing supports, additional unemployment, and additional investments in helping families become self-sufficient. So with the right policies, it's a choice for us all. And what I love about our country is if you're not getting the right answer at the federal, state, or local, there's 3 levels of government, and then there's also your neighborhood. So we have a lot of ability, if we want to look at the policy choices, make the right policy choices to help housing providers and people living in housing, and we can do that everywhere we live. And shining the light on it, though, is I think one of the biggest things that I've learned from this process, because that data that Callie showed, this is a race issue as well, and I think that's not always talked about, but that data does not lie.
I'll just mention, Regina mentioned I'm a current master's student, so I'm actually doing my final capstone on the Virginia Eviction Reduction Pilot and looking at community outreach, which has been super interesting to learn more about the program and how wonderful it is and how needed it is. But I think just thinking about that program and other programs that, hopefully will come along as we continue to work on this issue, is just making sure that all tenants have equal access to it, and making sure that, like in the rent relief program, landlords are passing tenants along to get access to rent relief, just making sure that those landlords are helping all tenants and not being selective about who they may be helping, and things like that, I think is a concern as far as evictions connection to fair housing as we move forward with these types of policies.
So I'm going to ask, how are we on time? We good? Okay. And I know in some of the conversations we've had, in the questions, you may have answered this in somewhat, but what intervention strategies really work, and what do we need to do to curb evictions? I'm going to ask Erik about that.
I'll be brief. Really brief. I touched on it earlier. I think the key thing is that I believe that a Virginia eviction reduction effort statewide, a coordinated effort in every locality and or region of the Commonwealth, has so much low-hanging fruit that those kind of strategies that are flexible. Rent relief obviously is the biggest need, but childcare, medical bills, there's a range, helping as families present with our human services system, community action agencies, our departments of social services, our nonprofit partners, to help families where they are to overcome that bump in a current system that has many families living on the verge of eviction and bankruptcy and foreclosure. That kind of system would be incredible, and it's very much within our reach. So that's the intervention. I'd call it VERP 4.0. The next, making sure every courthouse has court navigation, making sure every locality has a task force, and that's united in saying our system is not going to be based on a churn of families that disproportionately impacts kids. If you can't get behind that, I don't know what you can get behind. That could be the system created. And I think there's a bipartisan consensus that can continue to evolve in the General Assembly to, and we've seen bipartisan support in the past to create such a system. And I think the messaging is critical. I think it's critical that those of us as housing providers and those of us that work to represent and advocate for families in housing work together on and battle it out over how we can get more funds to invest a little bit of money here to save a lot of money for the state long term.
I think one of the things that I heard too that I think that's really, really important is that community outreach, because the more information people have, the more that they know really what their rights are, what they can do, what shouldn't happen, the better informed and equipped they are to bring forth what's going on, because we're going on certain things that we've heard, the data that we've taken in, but it's so much out there that we're not hearing that would add to these numbers, but at least people would be aware and know which way to go. So I'm going to ask Callie, what are there other data needs to better plan and access policy interventions?
This is, okay, I think this one's working. Sorry, I pulled out my phone because I have a list of some data that would be super helpful. So first of all, in Virginia, we don't have a lot of information on the property level. So I mentioned we have the evictor's catalog, but that only shows us who is filing against the tenant. So in many cases, it may be property manager. They have a lot of properties, so we don't actually know where those evictions are coming from. So increasing the amount of access to that eviction data at closer spatial scales would allow us to really understand where those evictions are actually occurring. But at the same time, it would be important to seal those records so that they could only be used by screening services or landlords, or even sealing them so that they aren't used by those. But that's a whole nother conversation. And then we also need more information about leases. We don't know a lot about leases that tenants are signing in terms of what they say. There's an act called the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which requires mortgage lenders to say what they're putting in their terms. But we don't have anything like that for leases. So something similar to that would really help renters and the renter market understand the implications of those leasing fees, like Laura was mentioning, the terms, and all the things that would be included in that lease. And then lastly, we also need more information on housing operating costs so that we can understand as providers and those who are maybe trying to help with affordable housing, be able to mount more effective efforts and then figure out the limits to rent increases for the future, because right now in Virginia, we don't have really any limits as far as how much rents can be increased. But if we had more information about operating costs, that's something that could be considered to make sure that tenants are protected as far as how much rents go up.
That is a critical one because in and out. Hello? No? Thank you. We know this one works. But that is really critical because when you talk about the cost of, what does it cost you as the investor, as the owner, to maintain this property? Because it's just amazing to me how rents were, $900 and now, in a year's time, it's $1,500. I mean, your cost did not jump that way. You don't, and you're not, and in many cases, there's nothing new added. You haven't done anything. You haven't changed any service. So to me, that is a really important one. Okay, I'm going to stop shouting. So anyway, and this is for Laura. Talk more about policymakers. What are policymakers doing right now to address evictions?
I'm going to piggyback on the last question real quick. One of the bills that passed last year was requiring reporting of sheriff's returned writs. That's that last stage in the eviction process. And I think part of the, I think it's an important data point to understand, but it is only one piece of what is an eviction. It doesn't really give us context to all the moves that happen, forced moves that happen before the actual sheriff's eviction, the number of households that move before the sheriff shows up at the door. But I'm also going to raise some alarm bells on that data because I know RV Eviction Lab and Legal Services Corporation has a court data project as well. You can go to their website, check it out. They have a lot of great data for Virginia. They did some scraping, and in the city of Richmond, which still has some of the highest eviction rates, in the past year, there was 1,200 something judgments, 1,200 something writs issued, but only one marked as return. There is no way. There was only one sheriff's eviction in Richmond in the past year. That means the court clerks are not entering the data into the system. And the state is supposed to be putting out our first report this summer about the number of sheriff's writ returns, and we don't have good data. So I would ask that you work with your local courts to make sure that the clerks are putting that information in so that we have accurate information that the state is reporting on. So that's a data need for sure. Now to the question you actually asked me about policy. I mentioned before that it is the upside is we have a great new class of General Assembly members who care about this issue, and we saw a historic number of housing legislation this year to really tackle the problem. Home, we had 10 of our own bills, and that was just one piece, people working on building more affordable housing, eviction prevention, and other protections. So some of the stuff we saw, I'll put into a few different buckets. One is fixing the court process, trying to make sure that it doesn't become this automatic thing and we're respecting the due process rights of tenants when they're in court. One of the issues that Home saw with the rent relief program is, a tenant might get like the court papers that someone's for unlawful detainer saying they owe one amount of money, but then they go in the court and suddenly the landlord attorney is getting a judgment for twice that. I don't know if anyone has looked at a summons for unlawful detainer form, but there's this little checkbox that the landlord can tick off to say that they're going to ask for any rent that has accrued since filing the lawsuit. Part of the reason that was added was to prevent what's called serial eviction filings, where a landlord is filing a new eviction case every single month that the tenant is late. Because I'm sure, as you all know, even having an eviction filing on your record makes it that much harder to find housing in the future. It also increases costs to tenants because the landlords are not paying those filing fees, they're passing them on to the tenant, as well as attorney fees. So it does make evictions also more costly for the tenant and harder to catch up. So I think VERP data showed that VERP was really good at reducing the number of serial eviction filings. But when the General Assembly made that change in 2019, they kept the checkbox, but they inadvertently left out a part that you're required to do that in order to amend upwards. So we saw quite a few cases where landlord didn't even check that off, but they were still able to go into court and ask for more money. Now, I don't know about you, like if I got a speeding ticket for like $50, I'd be like, you know what, $50, I'm not gonna take off work to go to court to deal with a $50 speeding ticket. But if I found out that my speeding ticket was actually $200, I'm sure as heck gonna go to court. So if I get sued for an eviction for one amount, it's like, oh, well, I'll just pay that, it's fine, I can catch up. And you don't go to court and then suddenly you have a judgment amount that's for several $100s more. That would have changed my calculation about what I'm doing, reaching out for rent relief, going to court. And so tenants need to be put on notice of how much the landlord is actually going to be asking them for. So one of the bills that we were able to work well across bipartisan effort, I think it passed out unanimously, and the governor did sign this one, worked really close with lobbyists for the housing industry, is fixing that process to make sure that we don't want serial eviction filings, but when you're suing a tenant, you have to notify them if you're going to be asking for money and what that amount is. If for some reason, the landlord doesn't do that, they can still raise it in court. They just have to give the tenant time to, reach out for rent relief and figure out how to get that money together. So that was a success. And there was like a few other bills to really deal with that court process. Unfortunately, the governor amended one of those in a way that guts the bill. General Assembly's meeting starting next Wednesday for a reconvene session for them to consider all of the governor's vetoes and amendments to the bill. So we're hoping they reject that amendment, and who knows what happens after that. The other bucket has to do with tenant protections, making sure that if you have a lease with all of these junk fees, make sure you put on the first page of the lease and are not burying it in a 60-page document, expecting tenants to know how this is going to add up. So hopefully, I think the governor had an amendment on that one that I don't think is too terrible. We'll see what happens. And then other stuff with rights, such as greater protections against retaliation. I'm sure you all see this in your work, but if a tenant complains about the conditions in their home, a lot of times the landlord's like, all right, well, get out. You don't like it here? Go live somewhere else. Or I'm just not going to renew your lease. You're a troubled tenant because you're complaining about having mold in your apartment. Or if someone reaches out to an attorney because they've been discriminated against, landlord finds out and they retaliate by evicting them. We have some protections in Virginia, but they're very difficult to enforce and they're very weak, and they don't protect against some of the common forms of retaliation, such as harassment. It only protected against retaliatory evictions and not those other types of abusive behavior. So again, this is a bill that we worked across the aisle and worked with, housing providers to come up with more robust protections. Unfortunately, the governor vetoed that, but I think there is a commitment from the General Assembly and all the stakeholders to keep working on this moving forward. And then there's the affordable housing side, a real big push to create more down payment assistance programs that reaches, all parts of the state, particularly rural areas that don't normally get that type of infusion of funding. Efforts to increase the amount of funding in the VERP program, as well as create a state-based voucher program that was called the 5,000 Families Program that would have been targeted towards families with children, I believe 16 and younger, to provide direct rental assistance. Unfortunately, that did not make it into the budget. So a lot of great things. Sad to see a lot of those were either vetoed or amended in a way that renders them ineffective. But the hopeful side is I think there is a commitment from our legislators moving forward that this is something to take seriously, something that affects every part of the state. I mean, if you just look at a map of Virginia of housing cost burden households, so if you're paying more than 30% or even 50% more towards your housing costs, it touches every single jurisdiction in Virginia. Everyone is paying too much for housing, both for mortgage payments, but also rent across the board. And I think there's still a lot of momentum to keep working on this, even though I was feeling very despondent Monday, finding out that all my bills got vetoed. And then at the national level, there are several bills in Congress to create more tenant protections, more transparency and tenant screening processes, as well as a national down payment assistance program, adding source of funds to the National Fair Housing Act as another protected class. A whole slew of things. One of the other exciting ones, sorry to keep going on, is called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. And it's something that we had in 2015 that the previous administration got rid of, but the Biden administration has gone through the rulemaking process. We're expecting the final rule any day now. But this is a really powerful tool for localities and local agencies that receive HUD funding to put together what's called an equity plan. And it's looking at not just, okay, how do we make sure we're not continuing to perpetuate housing discrimination, but what are we doing proactively to overcome patterns of discrimination? What is our actual plan? We've been stuck in this cycle of where we have red line neighborhoods. How do we, redraw the map basically? What are we doing at a local and a regional level to overcome? It has a really strong public engagement component of requiring community meetings and transparency throughout the entire process. So it's really wanting to encourage that community outreach engagement. So we're pulling in people who have typically been disenfranchised to have a say in the process and what that looks like. I would ask if you would like be helpful is to put pressure on the White House to release this new Affirmatively Fair Housing Rule. We are expecting it to be finalized and come out this month, but there's been some cold feet and delay about it. So any pressure, if you want to call your representative, like, hey, we need this tool, please release the final AFFH rule. I appreciate that advocacy. Yes, the other exciting thing that passed is eviction expungement. A couple of years ago, we passed a law that if someone's eviction case was dismissed or if the landlord non-suited it, the tenant could petition the court to get that expunged, meaning it would be removed from their record. It would no longer be a hindrance in finding housing in the future. It's really difficult to get people to do something proactive of doing a petition. It takes time. But one of the things that passed this year and the governor signed is to make it automatic. So starting July 1, any evictions that happened after that, if the case is dismissed or non-suited, it is automatically expunged. Yes. Now, if you have clients who have an eviction that's entered in prior to July 1 of this year, they can still petition to have that removed. And I think some of the legal aid programs have clinics to help with that. Yes, yeah, Legal Aid Society of Eastern Virginia has a program to help people with that. So you have clients, refer them there to help fill out the paperwork. I know it can be really daunting and scary for people to go to court and figure out what they need to submit. So that's a really helpful tool to lean on. It would be some of the other changes that we'd like to see in the future is making sure that children are not listed on eviction lawsuits. And yeah. And that there's not an eviction judgment if the tenant has already moved out of the property, but this is future work to be done.
So overall, we know that in hearing what Laura has shared and everybody else, what's really important from all of us here and with the clients that we serve and our advocacy work is that we have to get involved with policy, okay? Policy is going to make changes. And so I would say certainly follow HOME's website. what our policy work that we're doing, and listen to, we'll work with the other panelists and whatever information they put out there. But policy is the way things are going to change. Okay, and we have to be proactive about that, and we have to follow it. We have to understand that it's really not difficult to pick up the phone and call your representative. And as Laura stated, we have a lot of new folk, and so it's time now to begin having those conversations to prepare for next year's General Assembly. Okay, so we need to really work together here. Before we go to questions and answers in the audience, I want to ask Erik, how do evictions fit into the larger picture of community needs?
It's a couple things that I mentioned, I'll just repeat, is that, like you said so eloquently just now, poverty is a policy choice, evictions are a policy choice that we have the tools to radically change. And I guess I just would put in the larger context, I mean, I can't get that slide out of my head from Callie that, the biggest factor in evictions is whether you're a child, whether you're a Black woman, that's regardless of poverty rate, that's the largest factor. So, and then the second was poverty, right? And so I guess I'd just say that one of the things why I love working in community action is that we really view things from a systemic level of, how everything's interconnected, how childcare, housing, economic policy, community development policy, it's all connected. And so I just would say that I also think that this effort on eviction prevention, some of the core things that will help reduce just in general the amount of a challenge we have together to serve people is increasing the supply of affordable housing that we've talked about so much today. There is just not enough supply to at all income points in Virginia, and so disproportionately low income Virginians are impacted. And then with our tax policy, there's been some important debates that I hope will continue on our tax policies, ensuring that things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, one of the largest anti-poverty programs in our country, and now we, for the first time, have a Virginia state partially refundable Earned Income Tax Credit that took decades to come about. There's some major tools, and I just come out of the pandemic, there were so many programs were created, and so many of us worked on all the check boxes to get people signed up and applying for different things, and the challenge of the administrative challenge. The folks at Virginia Housing, DHCD, and the rent and mortgage relief grantees did Herculean efforts. But at the end of the day, if we have the right tax policies to ensure that all Virginians and Americans can be self-sufficient, and we have a tax policy that ensures that there's more fairness to our economy, then the number of people we have to serve with evictions dramatically decreases, and we can even focus more on those families. So I would just say this is connected to the overall work on the systemic issues that cause poverty, and that there's some lessons learned too in tandem with eviction. I think eviction, though, as we've talked about, is one of the most violent manifestations of poverty. It's because it's impacting our kids, right, and our communities in such a way. So I would just say, let's shine the light on evictions and end evictions, but also connect it to our overall work on tax policy and a fair economy.
So policy. I want to open it up now to the audience, our in-person and virtual. You have a few questions?
So one of the first questions is to the Eviction Lab. What are potential solutions to address the racial disparities for households facing evictions?
I feel like the answer is all of the things that we've been talking about, policy. As a data person, maybe I'm not the person to talk about them, but I feel like everything Laura was just mentioning about all the General Assembly changes and things that are coming about are a big step in the right direction. But I think, again, we were talking about how all of this comes back to historic redlining and a lot of things in the past that we haven't come that far away from those things. And so I don't know how to address that, but I think that need is gonna.
Yeah, I'm actually going to shout out Alexandria again and talk about one of the things they found that's successful, particularly, in families with children, is having this connection with the school system, with their McKinney-Vento coordinator. They're able to have that data sharing to see, like, okay, you have students who live in these high evicting properties. Let's do this outreach. It's another touch points with parents directly through the schools. They also work with a local church to text people to let them know, hey, you have an eviction case going up. They have to do some weird data stuff, so it's always the exact match. And sometimes they're texting people that's the wrong number, and they're like, "Oh my God, why do I have an eviction?" But it has a, but that touch point is incredibly helpful, and like being able to bring together the schools, your faith community, your nonprofits, and legal aid in that level of coordination, I think is part of what it takes. If we're not having state level interventions, is something that you all can do right now, and at the state level. Making sure that evictions are not a business model that properties are relying on, that it is a tool of last resort if you have someone's behind on rent. We've seen really successful models, particularly with our nonprofit affordable housing providers that use an eviction last model. When they have that lease signing, going over the tenant to make sure they understand the terms of their lease, when they're expected to pay rent, where they can go to pay rent, what to do if they're late, and if they are late, having that initial outreach to see, like, what's the situation? Can we just get you at a payment plan? Are you only like $50 behind? We don't need to see you for $50. Helping them catch up and going through all those intervention efforts before they ever file an eviction case. Now, I'm not going to say I expect all of our private landlords to do the same process, but let's not have this automatic process where they're filing on day 5. And this is where the state comes in. We can make sure that they have to wait longer. One of the bills this year that I forgot to mention was extending that 5-day pay or quit period to 14 days, which we had during the pandemic as one of those protections. Those 14 days make a massive difference for a family, particularly one who is living paycheck to paycheck. It may be that one paycheck is not enough to cover the entirety of their rent, particularly if there's they lose hours on a job, or they have a car breakdown or medical, whatever the case is. They just need to get to that next paycheck, and they'll catch up on rent. If you have 14 days, it gives them enough time to get there. This bill passed the legislature. Unfortunately, the governor vetoed it, but I know the bill patron who represents Newport News is committed to keep bringing this back every year until we can get it passed.
Quick question, because we work with veterans who are experiencing homelessness, and one of the things that we're noticing is, I believe you mentioned, where the property owner says, well, I know the lease says you could pay by check, but now we've gone to an automated system, and we have someone who's experiencing homelessness that they have to pay a portion of the rent, the agency pays another portion. So meanwhile, while trying to get the automated stuff straightened out, here comes it's after the 5th, so here's the late fee, and now it's the 5-day pay or quit. And, is there anything coming down the pipe where some sort of legislation? Oh, good. Thank you.
Sounds like you're talking about 2 protected classes here, veteran status and source of funds protections. Source of funds protections, like, pretty momentous thing that Virginia passed in 2020. But we immediately went into a pandemic, and a lot of people don't understand how this works or how it applies. I think people have this image of, like, oh, this is just making sure landlords aren't denying voucher holders, but applies to any type of government or nonprofit assistance So it includes, vouchers for veterans. It includes Social Security. It includes disability income. All those are covered under source of funds. Landlords cannot discriminate based on those payments. And we also see this a lot, particularly when it comes to like disability payments or retirement money. This Social Security checks, they're not going on the first of the month. They're doing it based on your birthday. So you might not get a check until the 20th. One of the things we're really trying to educate people about is asking for what's called a reasonable accommodation. Basically going to the landlord like, can you please change your policy about when the rent is due based on, when my rent is due, because I'm not getting my check until the 15th. Can you please move the due date to the 16th or the 18th? And if a landlord refuses to that, that is a fair housing violation. Yes, so I think this is an area we need to educate our housing providers on. Yes, easy, yeah. And I believe we have information on our website about what that looks like. Happy to do if you have housing providers and aren't aware of this. We'll come do a training for them.
Absolutely, that's what I do. So I'll come out and I tell you how to do these things, right? And anybody here, and if you're working through that, you can certainly call me. I know our fair housing team, they are they're swamped with a lot of things, but I tell people that they can call me as well because I used to work on the fair housing team, so I understand all of that. But I'm going to get the next question. Yeah, but anybody who wants training, or I will do it virtually. I'll come to you. I'll come to a community center, the church, whatever you need. I'm willing to share the information. So, online question.
Yeah, following back to the legislation questions. So, is there any specific legislations that would be helpful to advocate for, as well as are evictions related to any of the governor's recent proposed budget amendments? Is there anything we can do now as the General Assembly session closes?
There's so much you can do. In fact, I think we're going to have a follow-up email probably Friday or Monday to talk about what has happened to some of these bills, ones that were vetoed or amended. As I mentioned, the General Assembly is reconvening next Wednesday. That might even spill into Thursday to deal with this historic number of vetoes that we've seen. And, try to override some of these vetoes. I don't have a whole lot of faith that that's going to happen. But for some of these other bills that worked really hard with all the stakeholders on to reject the amendments, to really stick to what we worked out through this very difficult legislative process. One of them actually gets to the issue with having to pay a fee to pay your rent. One of the bills that we worked really hard on was making sure that there's at least some method of someone to pay the rent that doesn't have a fee. This has been cropping up a lot, people forcing you to pay online that has a service fee. We're seeing increasingly with some properties that they don't have a property manager in the office full time, but all right, let's just mail a check. Why are you adding on to the cost of housing? So there's a bill to address that. Hopefully the General Assembly will reject an amendment to that bill that would still allow landlords to charge that fee. So contact your legislators. I think, they need to hear from you that this is an important issue that their constituents care about, and having those real life stories makes a difference. I wish we could say we're in a policy environment where you could just point to the data and everybody's like, oh, great. I think we saw that, in 2019, that shock value, but it's starting to lose its loses magic, but being able to share real life stories of how this is impacting people on a daily basis and makes those numbers real and less abstract. And just sharing stories with legislators, I think, is really helpful.
I got two more, if I'm allowed. Okay. The first one is, in Richmond, our city council's only solution to evictions is affordable housing due to the Dillon rule. However, we're seeing that few residents of Richmond can afford those units. Anything less than the deeply affordable at 30% AMI is contributing to displacing residents. Where can we bridge the gap?
So great question. I guess I'd take it more broadly. And one thing I wanted to add on to what Laura said is that a thing I've learned from community action is in all of our advocacy, it's really humanizing this issue, and so really helping with these eviction task forces like in Alexandria or with our community action boards. We have people with lived experience of poverty and evictions helping inform our policies. And I would just say that's one of the things that can get missing if you've never been at a court as eviction proceedings are happening in mass, or you've never met a child who was forced out of their home through an eviction process. It's hard. It's some of that fervor for dealing addressing this issue head on is lost. So that's something I think we can all always do more, is making sure we're doing that. In terms of permanent supportive housing, I mean, that is one of the critical needs in our Commonwealth. And there's, when I was, I'm not up to speed on the latest numbers, but when I was at the Department of Housing and Community Development, we had a stat, and the General Assembly and Governor are working together on how many units we need statewide to really address the need there for the cycle of individuals from chronic homelessness to jails to other large investments that are made by the state, as opposed to just housing people. It's a bit. So permanent supportive housing, one of the strongest tool there is the Housing Trust Fund, and that's the Virginia State Housing Trust Fund. There's been some bipartisan support for that, the housing development community, and I encourage everyone to really utilize that tool and the tools at Virginia Housing as well as DHCD to help have some of those incentive funds. But in my opinion, that alone cannot solve the issue. The questionnaire asked. I really think it's land use as well. And Housing Forward Virginia, I would point you to them and some of the stuff they're doing with the zoning atlas and the working in communities. Anna Levitt, our member in the Stanton, Augusta, Waynesboro area, and others doing a housing coalition to look at like what are the big challenges. Land uses and just zoning for more affordable units is the biggest issue. So people that ask me that question, I say get involved with your planning commission and go to your local meetings.
I'm going to give it back to Laura, but yeah, that is a big issue. If in your locality, if you have an ordinance that says, with any new development, 25% that there be at least 25% affordable units, you make it 30%. You know what your needs are, but again, that's a zoning issue.
Yeah, I think this is my prejudice as an attorney. I used to be also fearful of the Dillon rule. So I was like, oh, it's all up to the state to do it. But since becoming home, I've really changed my mind on this. Localities, their control is through land use and the purse. I think it says a lot about locality of how they choose to spend their own money. I've seen in jurisdictions that the only money they put towards housing is through federal and state funding. Housing is not a priority. But if you go to a place, they put their own money towards housing programs, whether it's through a local affordable housing trust fund or local rent relief program or universal basic income program. I think that says a lot about the values and what that locality cares about. So if you want your locality to show that, yes, we are committed to solving this issue, put your own money on the table to fund these things. There's a lot localities can do with a small amount of money. I think, as Erik mentioned, that if you're able to do that prevention on the first site, that is so much less expensive than waiting for someone to get evicted, disruption in schools, huge reliance on emergency services. That costs localities money, and they're going to save that if they prevent on the front end through things like funding more attorneys in court, more court navigation, more other intervention efforts, but also through the land use. I mean, modern day form of like redlining is through where you're allowed to build stuff. It is hard to build affordable housing because of where you can build. You're limited to those. You can't go build in single family neighborhoods. So that restricts where you can build. Alexandria recently passed missing middle. And this is like duplexes and quadplexes, so they can build those in areas that used to only be zoned for single family homes. You're not building giant skyrise apartments in those communities, something that really meets the character of the neighborhood, but you're still adding more housing, which helps bring down cost overall. So localities can do a lot through land use policy in person.
In know what's going on in your locality. I'm sorry, I know what's going on in your locality because over the years, I've known localities that have refused federal dollars. Okay, so that tells you a lot about where their thought is on affordable housing or making it work when you just give the money back and say, oh, we don't want that. Sorry. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention also for the person that asked that question, it does sound like City Council in Richmond is going to pass a right to counsel, which is not helping with the affordability issue, but is helping with those that are getting evicted. Currently, if you're evicted, you aren't given counsel like you are in a criminal case, and so this would help folks to get that. And I think they might put $1 million towards it. I don't know if someone knows. Yeah, which is not a ton, but it's a really good start. So.
Going back to federal funds, somebody wanted to pose the question about vouchers and the payment standards. So the question goes, can anyone comment on the potential to filing a source of funds discrimination complaints on the basis of source of funds when landlords raise rents beyond the HUD payment standards? Is that a fair housing source of funds violation?
I would say yes. This is, I think, another data need to bring these type of cases is you have to understand how that landlord is raising rents for all the tenants and are they treating voucher holders differently. I think we also see in the Hampton Roads and Norfolk area, places that'll raise the rent every time like the military housing allowance goes up, they're always raising the rent. Like to me, that's a glaring fair housing violation, but you have to have that show that they're treating it differently and it is a data-driven issue. But I don't know, Regina, if you want to say something else.
No, I was just going to say that all of you in the room know who we are, and when you have issues, when you want to have more of this discussion, then you call home. And I think that beyond this day, I know everybody has a busy work schedule, but we have so many creative minds in this room. We can get together periodically and try to figure some of this stuff out and come up with some new ideas because we have the answers together. And I want to pass it on to Yvette, if you want to come up. Oh, any more questions? Sorry. So are we done? Okay. Well, I want to thank all of you here present today and those of you who are virtual for your sharing your time today and coming out to listen to what we were talking about today, which is so important. It still bothers me that Virginia in itself is when you look at the top 10 places in the country with the highest amount of evictions, that we're 5 of the top 10. So Virginia clearly has an issue, and we've got to make some changes. And we can do that by getting together, using the information you've received today, having more conversation, reaching out to your communities, and I could go on and on. But I want to thank our panelists. Everybody give them a hand. Thank them so much for their input. Again, you guys be safe for the rest of the day. And I think our next session on the 23rd is called, Mike has got it. It's called AI. I think the new face of housing discrimination. That's on the 23rd, and that is virtual. So you can go to our website and look for that. And of course, as mentioned earlier, on Tuesday the 23rd, same day, 8:30 to 10:30, HR CAP has invited everyone to the Pathways to Process breakfast. So thank you again for your participation and hope to see you all soon. Oh, don't forget on the tables, there's a form there, an evaluation form. If you would please fill that out. For those of you virtually, there should be a QR code somewhere. If you would use that QR code to give your comments about what you've heard today and the presentation. So thank you all so very much.